Thank you all for joining us today for this talk about discovering requirements BDD style. I'm Raj, and along with me is George. George, say hey.
Hey.
And as with, I don't know if some of you have probably attended some of our previous talks. A lot of what we try to share is based and born out of our experience with teams, and this is no different. George and I are going to talk about a specific technique that you could apply for discovering essential requirements. I'm assuming most of us are on some sort of an agile journey with teams. Before we get into the actual specifics of the technique, I want to sort of frame the context. So this is within the context of behavior-driven development. And for those of you who are probably not familiar with BDD, it's a set of practices that's primarily aimed at ensuring that there is a shared understanding and clarity on the essential requirements your customer needs. You want to make sure that there's a shared understanding between customers, business owners, and sponsors, your developers and testers, right? That's the shared context we're trying to establish around those essential requirements. And BDD is a process, but a key ingredient in the entire BDD rhythm is about ensuring that there is that shared understanding of the customer needs and the requirements. And as you can see in that definition, collaboration and conversation among the different perspectives, business, development, testing, to understand the essential requirements and express them and document them in a common language to make sure that we are really building the right thing, right? So that's an essential core philosophy of behavior-driven development, or BDD. Now, why am I talking about BDD? It's because the technique that we're going to introduce sort of fits nicely within the BDD process. George, if you can go to the next slide, please. The four essential steps within the BDD process, I'll just quickly walk through that, and then we'll get to the specific technique that I'm going to talk about. The BDD starts with a conversation, right? And sometimes, and who's having the conversation? As I'd mentioned, it's primarily a conversation between the business sponsors or those with the actual customer need, the developers who are, obviously I'm talking about this within the software context, developers who are going to fulfill that need, testers who are probably going to validate that need. So all of those perspectives that are going to influence the outcome of that specific need get together and try to understand what the requirement is. So that's the first step of the BDD process. And at times, depending on the requirement of the need, it could be a simple conversation that you can whiteboard and everybody sort of leaves with that shared understanding. But more often than not, at least in our experience, it's more than just a simple ad hoc conversation. A little more structure is often needed to guide that conversation, to really understand and distill the essence of the problem that we're trying to solve. That's the discovery process. What typically happens coming out of that discover phase of the BDD process, and usually this happens early and often, and if you're following Scrum or some other Agile framework, it happens before you start to actually build out those features and stories, right? It happens prior to that. Those conversations typically yield some concrete acceptance criteria and scenarios around those customer needs, which then leads to the second step of the BDD process, which is formulating or documenting that shared understanding in some common language. And these days, Gherkin format, or the given when then format, is a popular format in which those acceptance criteria scenarios are captured, right? That's the second part, the formulation. Now, coming out of that, the third step of the BDD process, you could potentially automate these specifications or those acceptance criteria scenarios using tools such as JBehave, Cucumber, and whatnot, if that's your jam, right? You could also use these given when then formulations to drive your unit tests and also your manual tests if that's what you'd like to do. But automation is possible because we have tools that can understand this plain English or this plain language. The final step of the BDD process is actually sort of crafting these automated tests, validating the requirements as having been met or not, and the cycle continues, right? So these are the four essential steps in the BDD process. I know that too often, at least in my experience and George's experience, when you go to organizations, when you talk about BDD, they talk about automation just as step 3. But the reality is the essential phase that kicks off the BDD rhythm is really that conversation that needs to be had among those multiple perspectives, often popularly called the three amigos. And as I mentioned, sometimes a simple conversation is enough to understand the essential requirement, and more often than not, it's not. You need a structured technique to make sure that folks leave with a shared understanding of those essential requirements. So our focus is going to be around one specific technique that George is going to walk us through called feature mapping. I'm not suggesting that that's the only technique that you can bring to bear during the discovery phase of BDD, but it's what we are finding in our coaching and consulting work is that the rigor and structure that the particular technique that we're going to talk about brings to bear is actually quite beneficial in truly understanding and driving out those essential requirements. So George is going to walk us through that specific technique called feature mapping. And this is a technique, it's a structured technique to drive those conversations among those three amigos. And that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of the session. So George, take it away.
Yes, thanks, Raj. So yeah, as Raj was just saying, we're going to talk about feature mapping. This is a technique that Raj and I have used with teams to help them really kickstart their BDD process. As Raj was just emphasizing, BDD is not just the automation. It's not the given when thens. It's not the Gherkin syntax. That's a great partner, a great complement to it. But it really has to start with that conversation, with the discovery phase. When teams are collaborating, having that conversation, they can then really discover together, explore, and deeply understand the features that their customers need. Feature mapping is a great technique for facilitating and having that structured conversation. Now, the executable specifications, the given when thens, are a great byproduct of this process. And I'll show you at the end of all of this how all of that comes together very nicely. But really, it all starts with discovery, with the conversation, with the collaboration. This draws on a couple of other techniques. There's Matt Wynn's example mapping that many of you may be familiar with already, and Jeff Patton's story mapping. John Ferguson Smart, who wrote this book, BDD in Action by John Ferguson Smart. He's the one who created and pioneered feature mapping. And so we draw on his lessons for directing our teams and explaining to you how this all works. So let's start with a picture. So here's really a visualization of how this process works. And it starts at the beginning with a story. And a story here can be a user story. It can be any kind of requirement. It can be really big. We can apply feature mapping to all kinds of different domains and a lot of different sizes of stories and features, but it can help visualize this whole process and go forward from there. From this story or this requirement, the next thing that we need to understand, of course, are the personas, who the customer is, what the use case is that they would be following, so that we really can tune into the customer experience there and figure out some of the other things that are going to flow. So from that, then we will concentrate on some rules and examples. And I'll go in over a little bit of exactly what I mean by rules and what I mean by examples, and how that applies to this technique. Once we have some rules and examples, we will think about the different flows and the various steps that are involved in working out some of these examples and these test cases, and what the outcomes or the consequences are for following these steps and these flows. And then there's a lot of repeating, looking for different variations, trying to find some of the counter examples, some of the negative test cases, any kind of boundary conditions that will be nestled within there. And the reason why we advocate this particular technique is that when you bring all of this up in front of you as part of the team, you can start to inject some of these variations and find where all of these things are. And after you've done all of this, from all of it can emerge some beautiful executable specifications, some of the given when thens, the Gherkin scenarios that are so popular. The idea is to not start with those executable specifications. I think what Raj and I often find is that someone like a product owner or a business analyst will come to the team with some Gherkin scenarios already written. And usually then that's what the team focuses on. And a lot of times Gherkin scenarios are not very well crafted at the outset anyhow. So let's not focus on those. those can be the output of this conversation. Instead, we want to really focus on the conversation and discover together what all of those rules and the examples and the steps and flows are. Okay, keep this picture in mind as we move forward. So here's kind of a rough picture of what a feature map conversation will look like. And as I mentioned, it starts with the rules and the examples. Usually when we're talking about example mapping, we will talk about rules and examples. And rules are generally referred to as some of the abstract acceptance criteria, your usual garden variety requirements. And then the examples are there as concrete test cases, as scenarios that are there to illustrate, what exactly those abstract acceptance criteria are. These are the concrete scenarios that we usually craft after a little bit. And then after that, how this gets a little deeper than just example mapping and feature mapping. From those examples, we start thinking about the steps and steps that are actually there to illustrate the examples. And then from the steps, we will have some tangible business outcomes. And especially for the first run through any part of feature map, I advocate working from left to right, going from rules to examples to steps to outcomes. And then after you have a little bit of that, when you're rinsing and repeating, looking for those variances, you can sometimes find the steps or some of the outcomes and then work backwards from there to find out what the examples and maybe even some rules are. But this then winds up being a very freewheeling conversation that results in this structured visualization of what the conversation results in.
Hey, George, we have a question.
Excellent.
All right. Are there types of work that are not suitable for formal user stories or consideration of user personas? Example, bugs, security, upgrades, DevOps.
Yeah, I think I just responded to that, but George, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that you would use feature mapping for all of those types of stories. I mean, for some things that are, maybe quite apparent, like a defect or some sort of technical enabler. I mean, for a lot of the teams I work with, sometimes I see them start with some sort of give and win then for a technical enabler. And I think sometimes those can be kind of silly. So I wouldn't say that you necessarily need to focus on the user scenarios for something that doesn't lend itself very well for that. If you're unaccustomed to this approach, I would probably focus on something that does lend itself to the user journeys nicely. And you can think of what the story would be for how you would travel through some of the flows involved in this. And that would be a nice way to get started. And then as you get more and more accustomed to this process, and maybe there's some other types of stories that would lend themselves very well too. I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to limit yourselves to user stories that are all about business value, but maybe start with that and get accustomed to it, and expand your horizons as you see fit.
Yeah, feature mapping works particularly well when there's probably a lot of sort of hidden logic and sort of variations that are not quite apparent in the expression of the feature or the story, but intuitively, this is probably a big thing. That's where I think feature mapping really shines, because don't want to think that this is the only way to add structure to the Three Amigos conversations. There are a host of other techniques, but I think for even medium to moderately complex requirements, feature mapping can be a great way to add structure to the conversations.
Now that you have kind of an idea of what this picture is going to look like, in the abstract, let's go forward a little bit and see how it would look in some sort of hypothetical scenario. And we'll start thinking back to that picture with the circle and all the numbers. We'll start with the story and understanding the personas. And right here, I have a hypothetical story. Could be very big, could be maybe a little bit more narrow, but it's really up to the three amigos and the discovery process to really kind of come together and figure out just how feasible this would be, and maybe they'll find that they can break this down into multiple stories. But anyhow, this hypothetical story is related to loyalty membership with a specific large hotel. And we're going to think about essentially what the requirements are for implementing getting a free night program for hotel loyalty members. And top line, as a loyalty member, I can get free nights at hotels when I have accumulated enough points. And here are some of the rules that will guide the feature map that we're going to look at in a few seconds. So just to get an idea of what some of those post-its are going to look like. So each off-peak night at a regular hotel will cost 10,000 points. Each peak night at a regular hotel will cost 20,000 points. Each peak night at a swanky hotel will cost 50,000 points. And if you book 4 nights, you can book a 5th night for free. So that's the story that we're going to be starting with. The persona that we're looking at is some sort of a loyalty member, someone who is a member with this chain of hotels and has accumulated some points and now wants to come in and book some free nights based on some of the loyalty points they have accumulated. Here's kind of a concrete example of a feature map. And we've already talked about the story and the personas. Now the thing to think about are some rules and examples. And so the kind of top level rule is that we're going to be talking about hotel loyalty members being able to get free nights at hotels. And the example, the first one is the one where George has enough points for 4 free nights. And after we think about the rules and examples, working from left to right, we're going to think about the various steps and outcomes that are going to be associated with this one example. So the first thing is that George has a loyalty membership, and George has accumulated 40,000 loyalty points, and George wants to book 4 nights off peak. Well, as a result of that, the consequence is that he's going to get all 4 nights for free, and he's going to have the 40,000 loyalty points deducted from his account, and he'll be have 0 points remaining. So this is just one row that is going to help us understand this top line rule and example. But then the next thing to do after that is to really look for the variations. And so there are other examples, like the one where George gets a 5th night for free. And that was one thing that was included in the story. So one thing that's really, I think, very effective with feature mapping is that when we are repeating some of the steps, we can just draw some arrows to show that this is the same thing. And we don't really have to worry about it. We're looking for variances in that next row. So the really big variance in this next scenario is that George books 5 nights off peak, and he's going to get all 5 nights for free and have 0 points remaining. We're going to look for more variances. How about where he wants, he doesn't quite have enough points for everything he wants to stay. So something is going to need to be a little different. So George books 3 nights at peak. We can maybe remember from the previous slide, the story, that's 20,000 points per night. He only has 40,000 points. So he's going to have to pay out of his own pocket for that 3rd night. And then the next variance is, well, what if he wants to stay in a swanky hotel instead? And that's 50,000 points. That's beyond the 40. That means that he's going to have to pay out of pocket for that 1 night at the swanky hotel. This is obviously a rather potentially large requirement, and we could go into a lot of different variances off of this. And opening it up to the floor, I'm going to throw it out to y'all and ask, what are some other variances you might have in your conversation with your team, if you were on this team, that you would want to illustrate in this feature map?
And it could be an entirely different rule.
It could be.
Yeah. Think of the examples are just scenarios, right? Concrete manifestations of a given rule, right? So
we would want to look for counter examples. We'd want to hit all the boundary conditions. We might come up with some scenarios that are incredibly similar to the ones that are already here, and we would recognize as a team, well, this isn't exactly a unique example. We've already covered this, and this would be a nice way of visualizing that and understanding that we have already covered a particular test case.
So again, anything that comes to mind, either a
Yeah.
distinct rule or a variation on the existing rule?
One thing I would think is, maybe in that last one, or even the third one, where the one where George has enough points for most of his stay. Well, what if he wanted to buy some points? Would that be permissible? And would that be another rule? Would we want to have another rule and potentially another story to cover where someone would be allowed to buy some more points? Or maybe there would be an example where someone wants to book a stay that spans off-peak and peak. So we could build out this feature map really indefinitely to cover lots and lots of different variations. And one of the things that I think is particularly powerful about this approach, and I mean, there are a couple of things, but one is that in not having set the boundaries too much with a lot of detail in the story ahead of the three amigos, you allow the team to really dig into this, to poke around at a lot of the different boundaries and figure out where this story could be chopped into smaller pieces to make it so that it is truly feasible and valuable and testable.
Yeah.
Okay.
So George, I think Steve, hi Steve. So he threw out a scenario there. How about the ability to gift your points to someone else?
Oh,
yeah,
that could be interesting too. And I think that's a great one, and probably something that we would want to explore and put in some more rules and examples for that.
yeah.
What happens to George's loyalty points when he gifts his points to someone else?
And Steve, to that point, it could be a different story, it could be a different rule. So I think this is where I think that we'll have to start to see, right? Do you keep adding these scenarios to the existing rule or not? Because it seems like this could be a distinct a feature, if you will. Maybe not. Right. So.
Right. And another advantage, I think, to structuring the conversation with something like feature mapping, or maybe specifically feature mapping, is that it should direct the team toward really thinking about what the expected behavior is of the system, and to not focus so much on the implementation details. We want to focus on what we're going to build rather than how it's going to be built. So having this structured conversation really lends itself well to that. Okay. All right. So moving on, the last step in this whole process comes after the feature map is drawn. You can then have your team go and take this feature map and actually generate some wonderful executable specifications from it. And I've taken that top row from that feature map to show exactly how that feature map row can then go directly into a nicely structured Gherkin scenario. So we have the one where George has enough points for 4 free nights, right? And that's the scenario. And given George has a loyalty membership and George has 40,000 loyalty points, when George books 4 nights off peak, then George gets all 4 nights free and George has 0 points remaining. There you go. That's your Gherkin scenario. It's one discrete expected behavior. We have set up what we need in order to set this test up. We understand what the action will be under test. That's booking the 4 nights off peak. And we understand what the consequence, what the outcomes of this will be. And we understand how to test it. This is something valuable, feasible, and testable.
So this really touches upon the second phase of that, the BDD process, the formulation, right?
Right, exactly. So we have something that's formulated. At some point, we can then run this through Cucumber and have it fully automated and work it into our pipeline, and it'll be beautiful. But it all starts with the conversation. The conversation is the essential first element of this, the first ingredient. And then from that, all of the rest of it flows. I would like to conclude with a couple of quotations from some luminaries about collaboration and teamwork. One's Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "Many ideas grow better when transplanted into another mind than the one where they sprang up." You know, a great way to think about your conversations in BDD. And then from Lizzo, "If I'm shining, everybody gonna shine." So I won't give away which one of those I hold in higher esteem, but
Lizzo.
it's the second one, yes. So. All right, so that's really it for feature mapping and how it wraps up into BDD, and love to get some questions from everyone.